There is a moment in every life when the noise stops and the truth gets loud. I am not talking about a small setback or a bad day that fades with sleep. I mean the kind of moment that feels like the floor quietly disappears beneath your feet. When the plans collapse, the excuses run out, and the mirror suddenly feels impossible to avoid. This is the moment people often call rock bottom, but what they rarely admit is that it is also the birthplace of honesty. Not polite honesty, not social honesty, but the kind that strips away every comforting story you have ever told yourself. Most people spend years building a life supported by gentle illusions. We say we are fine when we are tired. We say we are busy when we are afraid. And we say we are stuck when we secretly know we are avoiding change. These small distortions feel harmless because they protect our identity from discomfort. They allow us to function, to smile, and to move through ordinary days without confronting the deeper questions we keep postponing. But eventually, life has a way of interrupting the story. A job disappears, a relationship ends, health falters, or a dream fails so loudly that denial can no longer drown it out. In those moments, the comfortable distance between who we pretend to be and who we really are collapses. And suddenly, the most frightening question becomes the simplest one. What if the life I built was based on half-truths I never questioned? This realization does not arrive gently. It arrives like silence after a storm, heavy, undeniable, and strangely clear. This is why Dr. Grandpa Henry often described crisis as an unexpected teacher rather than an enemy. He believed that when everything comfortable falls apart, the mind loses its favorite hiding places. There is no room left for denial when reality becomes louder than the story. And even though this moment feels brutal, it carries a strange gift. Honesty stops being a virtue and becomes a necessity. You no longer ask whether you want the truth, because the truth is the only thing left standing. This is the beginning of a transformation most people never expect. Rock bottom does not start by giving answers. It begins by removing every lie that once felt necessary, and in the uncomfortable space that remains, a new question quietly forms. If I stop pretending, who could I become? That question is terrifying because it demands responsibility instead of sympathy. It asks you to look at your habits, your choices, and your silent compromises without soft lighting or background music. It challenges the stories you repeat to friends, family, and most importantly to yourself. And although this confrontation feels like loss, it is secretly the first honest step toward rebuilding a life that no longer needs illusions. That is where the journey begins, in the quiet recognition that truth, once feared, may become the strongest foundation you will stand on. At first, radical honesty does not feel empowering. It feels terrifying because it removes the comforting belief that someone else will eventually rescue you. The mind searches desperately for a softer explanation, a loophole, a reason to delay the confrontation, but crisis has a way of closing every escape route one by one. You begin to notice patterns you once ignored, the habits you justified, the warnings you dismissed, the quiet intuition you silenced because it demanded change before you felt ready. Suddenly, the story of bad luck becomes harder to defend, and a deeper realization begins to rise with unsettling clarity. What if the collapse did not start today? What if it began months or even years ago in the small decisions you convinced yourself did not matter? This is the suspenseful crossroads where most people hesitate, because radical honesty does not only ask what happened, it asks what role you played in what happened. This question feels heavy because it replaces blame with responsibility. And responsibility feels frightening when you have spent years believing your circumstances were the main obstacle. The silence becomes louder during this stage, and the mind begins replaying memories like a movie you never wanted to watch. Conversations where you ignored your own needs, opportunities you avoided because comfort felt safer, warnings you laughed away because change seemed inconvenient. Each memory feels like a small piece of a puzzle slowly forming a picture you never intended to see. The realization builds slowly but relentlessly, and the suspense lies in the uncertainty of what you will do with this truth once it fully arrives. Many people reach this point and turn away because honesty feels like standing at the edge of a cliff without knowing if there is ground below. The fear whispers that if you admit everything, you might lose the identity you have spent years protecting. You might have to admit you stayed too long, waited too long, ignored too much, or settled for less than you deserved. But there is a hidden shift happening beneath the fear, something quiet and powerful that begins to change the way you see the collapse. The same honesty that feels like a threat slowly begins to feel like clarity. The confusion that once filled your mind starts to dissolve, and for the first time in a long time, the chaos begins to organize itself into something understandable. This is the turning point that Dr. Grandpa Henry often described as the bridge between pain and power. He explained that when you finally stop arguing with reality, you regain the energy you once spent defending illusions, and that energy becomes the fuel for rebuilding. The suspense reaches its peak here, because the next step is no longer about discovering the truth. It is about deciding whether you are brave enough to live by it. The moment stretches quietly, filled with possibility and fear at the same time, and the future waits patiently for the choice you are about to make. The moment you choose honesty as a daily practice, something remarkable begins to happen inside you. Something quieter than motivation, yet far more powerful than temporary inspiration. You begin to trust yourself again, not because life suddenly becomes easy, but because the distance between what you feel and what you admit starts to disappear. The energy once spent maintaining appearances becomes available for rebuilding your reality. You stop negotiating with excuses and start negotiating with possibility. Radical honesty becomes less about confession and more about construction. It becomes the blueprint for a new foundation, one built from clarity instead of comfort. You start noticing how small, truthful decisions create momentum. You admit when you are tired and finally rest without guilt. You admit when you are afraid and take action anyway. You admit when you want more and begin making space for it without apology. Each honest moment becomes a brick, and slowly the life that once collapsed begins to reshape itself into something stronger than before. What once felt like the end reveals itself as the beginning of a more intentional chapter. You realize that rock bottom was never meant to destroy you. It was meant to remove everything that could not support the person you are becoming. The fear that once paralyzed you now transforms into focus, and the uncertainty that once felt unbearable becomes evidence that new paths are finally opening. You begin to understand that honesty does not guarantee comfort, but it guarantees direction, and direction is far more valuable than false security. As days pass, your relationship with failure begins to change. You stop seeing it as proof of weakness and start seeing it as feedback from reality. This shift feels subtle at first, but it grows stronger with every honest reflection. You become less interested in looking successful and more committed to becoming real. And in that authenticity, a quiet confidence begins to grow. It is not loud or dramatic, but it is steady and resilient. It does not depend on approval or applause because it is rooted in self-respect. This is the unexpected reward of radical honesty, the realization that truth is not the enemy of hope, but the foundation of it. You no longer chase perfection because you are busy building alignment. You no longer wait for permission because you understand that responsibility is freedom in disguise. The collapse that once felt humiliating now feels meaningful, and the journey ahead feels earned rather than imagined. Life does not suddenly become predictable, but it becomes navigable, and that difference changes everything. You begin to see challenges as conversations instead of verdicts, and progress as a process instead of a finish line. The person who once feared the mirror now uses it as a guide, and the future no longer feels like a threat, but an open space waiting for honest effort. If you are benefiting from our topics, please subscribe, like, and turn on the bell notification so you can see our new videos early.